Do you think Americans truly understand the history of socialism and actually what it is? As you've gone around, I know you've had, when you speak to not just college campuses, you've been to events around the world. I think 250,000 people you've spoken in front of.
I mean, people are unbelievably ignorant about history. And I mean, I would include myself in that, you know. I mean, I know what I know about the history, say, preceding the 20th century is very sketchy. It's embarrassingly sketchy, you know. And what young people know about 20th century history is non-existent, especially about the history of the radical left. I mean, how would they know? They're never taught anything about it. So why would they be concerned about it? And you know, for many of the people in the audience, you know, you're old enough so that the fall of the Berlin Wall was, well, that was part of your life, you know. That was really the end of the Second World War, let's say, in a technical sense, and it was very meaningful. But that's a long time ago. There's been a lot of people born since then, and it's ancient history. And we don't have that many good, bad examples left, you know. There's North Korea, there's Venezuela, but we're not locked tooth and nail in a war with, you know, in a proxy war or in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And it's easy to understand why people are emotionally drawn to the ideals of socialism, let's say, or of the left, because it draws its fundamental motivational source from a kind of primary compassion. And that is always there in human beings. And so that proclivity for sensitivity to that political message will never go away. And so, and it's important to understand that. You have to give the devil his due, unfortunately.
You've also said that people aren't as resentful at the success of others as we might think. And I think as you watch a lot of people being interviewed today, and you watch some of the students being interviewed, you saw some of the ones up here, you hear people talking a lot about inequality, but you say they really aren't as resentful as we might think, as long as they don't think the game is fixed.
Yes, well, that's certainly the case. Well, first of all, I mean, if you look at the psychological literature, to the degree that it's accurate, which is difficult to ascertain often, people report far more prejudice against their group than against themselves. So that's quite an interesting phenomenon as far as I'm concerned. So there's a tendency for people to exaggerate the degree to which the group they belong to is currently suffering from generalized oppression. They've been relatively free of it themselves. I also think that, yeah, fairness is an absolutely essential, and perceived fairness is an absolutely essential component of peace, because people can tolerate inequality, so to speak, or even revel in it, let's say, if they believe that the unequal outcome is deserved. I mean, look at how people respond to sports heroes. You know, no one goes to a sports event and boos the star, even though he or she is paid much better and attracts the lion's share of the attention, hopefully not in too narcissistic a manner. People can celebrate success, but they do have to believe that the game is fair, and the game needs to be fair, because otherwise the hierarchy becomes tyrannical. The problem with the radical left is that it assumes that all hierarchies are tyrannical, and it makes no distinction between them, and that's an absolute catastrophe, because, you know, there's plenty of sins, let's say, on the conscience of the West as a civilization, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there are far worse places, like all the other places, for example, that there have ever been. Well, it's the case, and people also don't understand that, and they also don't understand, this is something that's of particular importance, they also don't understand, and that may even characterize you in this audience, it's the knowledge of how rapidly we're making economic improvements around the world, in the developing world, for example, how fast that's happening. That is not well distributed knowledge. You know, that between the year 2000 and the year 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world fell by 50%. Now, it's a UN figure, $1.90 a day, that was their cutoff for absolute poverty. And so the cynics have said, well, you know, that's a pretty low barrier. It's not such an achievement to have attained that, but I can tell you it's an achievement to have attained that if you were living on less than $1.90 a day to begin with. But if you look at, if you double the amount to 380 or you double it again to 760, you find the same pattern. I mean, the poor in the world are getting rich at a rate that is absolutely unparalleled in all of human history. And I think a large part of that is happening in Africa, where, by the way, here's another lovely piece of news. The child mortality rate in Africa is now the same as it was in Europe in 1952, which is, I mean, that's an absolute miracle. It's insane that that's not front page news, right? That's within a lifetime. And the fastest growing economies in the world are also there. And so,
but as you're saying, but why isn't it front page news? And when you're considering social media and how fast news and photos and all that can travel, and that young people are aficionados of all this technology, why don't they know these things? Or why aren't they computing what they see as being progress?
Well, I think part of it is that things are changing so fast that none of us can keep up. Like, it's hard to keep the story updated. I had no idea, for example, that most of the world's economic news, and even a substantial proportion of its ecological news, by the way, was positive until I started to work on a UN committee about 5 years ago on sustainable economic development. And I read very widely economically and also ecologically, and realized that things were way better than I had any sense of, that these improvements had come at a tremendous rate. But you see, partly it is just that it's so new that we don't know, and we don't have a story about it. And who would be driving the communication of such things, especially given two other things. One is that human beings are tilted towards negative emotion in terms of its potency. And so, for example, people would rather, they're much less happy to lose $5 than they are happy to gain $5. We're loss averse. Or we're more sensitive to negative emotion than we are to positive emotion. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is, well, you can only be so happy, but you can be dead. Right, and I mean, dead that's not good. And there can be a lot of misery on the way to that end. And so we're tilted to protect ourselves, and that makes us more interested in some sense and more easily captivated by the negative than by the positive. And so that's a hard bias to fight. And then when you also take into account, and I think this is something that's worth seriously considering, because the other thing we don't understand is the technological revolution that's occurring in every form of media. No one understands it. But one of the consequences is that the mainstream media, so to speak, is increasingly desperate for attention. Right? They exist in a shrinking market with shrinking margins. All of the leading newspapers and magazines are feeling the pinch. Television is dead because YouTube has everything that television has, and then incredible array of additional features. And radio is being replaced by podcasts, and so it's a very unstable time for the mainstream media. And what would you expect them to do except to do whatever they can to attract attention in whatever manner they can manage? One example of this, one very good example of this, is you may or may not know that the rates of violent crime in the United States, and actually in most places, have plummeted in the last 50 years. It's really quite remarkable. The United States is now safer in terms of violent crime than it has been since the early 60s, and that was probably the safest time there ever was. But the degree to which violent crime has been reported has increased. It's funny, the curves are almost completely opposite to one another. This is the decline in violent crime. This is the increase in the reporting of violent crime. And the reason for that is, well, people read stories about violent crime, and then, of course, they're much more likely to believe that it's on the increase. And the people who are most likely to believe that it's on the increase, by the way, are also those who are least likely to be affected by it. Because, you know, to be a victim of a violent crime, well, it helps to drink too much, but it also helps a lot to be young and male. And those aren't the people who are particularly afraid of violent crime, even though they're the ones most likely to be implicated in it. So there's technological reasons for our concentration on the negative, and they're complex. It's not easy to figure out how to combat the spiral of outrage and attention-seeking that I think is accompanying the death of our previous means of communication. No one knows how to handle that, and that's a big problem.